laws. I'm joined by Dr Nicola McGarity. She's the Director of the Terrorism Law Reform Project at the University of New South Wales. Dr McGarity, the government says it wants to make it easier to arrest terrorists and to prosecute foreign fighters. Will these laws do that?
I think actually what we've already got in Australia is some very, very wide-ranging anti-terrorism laws that already give investigators, whether they be from law enforcement or intelligence agencies, very wide-ranging powers to investigate terrorist acts, and also give prosecutors a great deal of tools to use in terms of the offences that they charge terrorists with.
Is there anything that suggests that the current laws are not working? Is there any research that has been done by academic bodies and the like to show that they aren't working?
The research that I've done actually suggests that the anti-terrorism laws are being very aggressively enforced in Australia. We've had 38 people charged in Australia with acts of terrorism, and 26 of those have been convicted. A relatively high success rate, one might think, that suggests that both the anti-terrorism laws are being aggressively used and also that the trial process is operating effectively.
The government argues that these laws are needed to keep Australia safe, and it also argues that this is what Australia's intelligence agencies are telling the government is needed. So shouldn't we trust our intelligence agencies to make representations to the government about any need for stronger laws?
I think there's another source of information that we should actually go to, and that is the reports of two independent inquiries that reported as recently as last year and actually recommended that some of the things that the government is now proposing to make permanent, things like preventative detention orders, things like ASIO detention powers, they actually recommended that these things should be repealed. They said that they were not only contradictory to fundamental human rights, but also were unnecessary, and that law enforcement agencies themselves said that they didn't think they were tools that were productive to the threat of terrorism, to dealing with the threat of terrorism.
I'd like to look at some of the specifics. For example, the government says that it will prohibit travel to a designated area, and people who go to those zones have to prove that they were there for humanitarian or family reasons. How might that work?
To me, this seems to be contradictory to one of the most fundamental of our principles of the criminal justice system, that being the presumption of innocence. Normally, what would happen in a prosecution is that the prosecutors would be required to prove every element of a criminal offence. What we're seeing here is actually a plan by the government to reverse that, to put the onus on the defence to prove that they haven't committed a criminal offence. I noticed some remarks
today from the Prime Minister that the government's not intending to reverse the onus of proof, but while the details are still being worked out of how these changes might work, would it mean that someone travelling to one of those areas should create or keep some sort of evidence about exactly what they were doing there if they're trying to make sure that they're not caught up at a later date?
I think that's precisely what it would do in practice. It would mean that the onus was upon the person travelling to prove that their travel was for some kind of innocent, non-terrorism related purpose. They'd be required to keep records as to the illness of a relative, and that being the reason why they travelled to Syria or Iraq. To me, that's not the way in which our criminal justice system should work. The onus should be on prosecutors to prove what is essentially the element of the offence that makes it criminal. Not the fact of travel, but the fact of travel for a particular terrorism-related reason.
We know the federal government has already cancelled the passports of several dozen people. The Foreign Minister says she'll also get increased powers to actually suspend a person's passport and to do that fairly quickly, acting on intelligence. Can you see any repercussions untoward about that?
To me, I don't have a problem with there being powers for a minister or ASIO to request in certain circumstances where a person may pose a risk by virtue of their travel to another country of prejudice to national security. I don't have a problem with there being tightly constrained circumstances in which the Minister and ASIO can suspend passports or cancel a person's foreign visa. And in fact, we've seen that in a number of cases in the terrorism context already in Australia over the last decade. The case of Mohammed Hanif, a situation in which Hanif's visa was cancelled. His foreign visa was cancelled in terms of his ability to stay in Australia. We already have powers like this on the statute books. We need to see the details of it to decide whether the changes that the government's making are necessary or whether they're going to be counterproductive.
Finally, would you agree, however, that it's very difficult for a government and indeed for a public to resist an argument that all they're trying to do is to keep Australia safe?
I think it is very difficult to resist that argument, but unfortunately I think what we're seeing here is much like what happened in the aftermath of September 11, much like what happened in the aftermath of the London bombings in 2005, a reactive, knee-jerk response by the government that fails to take into account whether our anti-terrorism laws that are already on the statute books are necessary and effective, and whether there are actually any gaps that need to be remedied.
All right, Dr. Nicola McGarity, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.